With this directive, the EU is going into uncharted territory in attempting to make our new digital lives more safe and secure. And this is admittedly not an easy process, as developing legislation on a highly technical issue that touches at the same time on national security is no easy task. The Latvian presidency continues and will continue to work to make significant progress on this file by the end of June. We are confident that the good spirit of cooperation will continue to allow us to reach timely conclusion of the negotiations on the Directive on Network and Information Security, to provide the EU and its member states with an instrument to improve its preparedness and capability for reaction in case of cyber attacks. At the same time, regulation of such innovative sectors must be achieved in a prudent and balanced manner to avoid unnecessary burden on an industry which is creating growth and jobs. We shall also continue our efforts towards introducing effective and creative practical preventive and countermeasures that will go beyond the necessary legislative minimum. Strategic communication, countering propaganda and international cooperation are on the list of our priorities. At the same time, despite this late hour, I would like to recall the root cause why independent and professional media are being targeted by such attacks. Dramatic changes in the media landscape, in particular the introduction of new technologies, have resulted in an unprecedented flow of information. Despite draconian measures, neither totalitarian regimes nor terrorists are able to firmly close the tap and fully prevent the information flow. Independent voices of journalists and reports give the international community a unique insight into realities on the ground, including in conflict zones. It is thanks to the journalists' courage that the world is aware of what happened in Chernobyl, Chechnya, Libya, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and what is happening in North Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and Ukraine. Media serve as a catalyst for a rapid and effective global response, and thus is vital to the survival of a democratic society. It is for this reason that our activities aiming at improving security, resilience and capabilities should go hand in hand with activities aiming at safeguarding and reinforcing the ability of the media to provide independent and reliable information. I thank you for your attention, and I thank you indeed for this very important debate.
Merci, Madame. Ceci clôt le...
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate. We now move on to the oral question to the Commission on ending the practice of early forced marriage of girls. I will give the floor to Mrs. Corazza-Bildt now, the author of this question.
Every minute are forced to marry in the world, including in Europe. They are exposed to abuse and violence and are denied their rights to health and education. They are robbed of their childhood. The UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in Conflict, Zanai Bangura, has now denounced the horrible sexual abuses and organized rapes committed by Daesh ISIS. Young girls are sold naked at the market and promised as brides as a price after recruitment. We also see an increased number of children given in marriage in refugee camps, with desperate parents trying to find a way out of poverty. And I want to tell you the heartbreaking story of Keda, a young girl from Chechnya, forced to marry a man 3 times her age despite her clear opposition. The journalist who reported is now under life threat. And just last week, an international conference on child marriage organized by the NGO Girls, Not Brides, it emerged that there are camps in countries like Zambia and Mozambique to initiate girls to sex and prepare them for marriage, sometimes before they turn 9. These are just a few chilling stories, but there are thousands more, and none of us can remain untouched. Child marriage is not only a violation of children's rights, but also violence against women. Unfortunately, only 11 member states have ratified the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention on combating violence against women, that recognizes child marriage as a criminal offence. And I therefore call on all the member states to ratify the convention and on the Commission to actively encourage more member states to enforce it. We cannot close our eyes. It is time to act to end this horrific practice. We are talking about children. I am proud that the EPP Group took the initiative of this public debate in plenary, and I warmly thank the FEMM Committee and its chair for this support. Let's join forces across political groups and at all levels to put an end to child marriage. The consequences are devastating. Girls' health is at stake, with serious risk of complications in pregnancies, childbirth, and even HIV infections. Girls are exposed to sexual abuse, domestic violence, and even honor killing. It is also a question of empowerment. Girls forced to marry are forced out of school, and education is the best chance for girls to develop skills and have a role in society. Keeping girls out of school is a way to condemn them to poverty and discrimination. I therefore welcome that the European External Action Service and the Member States have put child marriage as a priority in the EU Action Plan for Human Rights and Democracy and the EU Development Cooperation Gender Action Plan. However, progress has been slow and uneven. I therefore call on the High Representative and the Commission to implement this commitment in all the dialogues and programmes with third countries and regional organisations. Madam Chair, the upcoming conference on financing for development in Addis Ababa in July will be a test to our leaders. Child marriage should be included as a priority in post-2015 development agenda. We need to work with law enforcement authorities, the judicial system, the police, also providing training and technical assistance to adopt and enforce legislation prohibiting early and forced marriages, including minimum age for marriage. But it's not enough. The EU has an important role also in supporting information and awareness campaigns, and our challenge is to combat stereotypes. Violence against children and women should never be justified by culture, tradition or religion. And it is time to break the vicious circle of poverty, submission and violence. We need to work together with religious communities, schools, media to change attitude. We need to help families and community leaders to keep girls in school and protect them from violence. And Madam Chair, let me here thank the many international organisations, UNICEF, the many NGOs and civil society who are doing a great job. It is about girls' dignity. And our message should be, to the 50 million girls a year, and I finish, you are not alone. The European Parliament will remain committed to work with all concerned to keep at the top of the EU agenda a zero-tolerance policy against child marriage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Madame. Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mimica from the Commission next.
Thank you, Madam President. Honourable members, early or forced marriages constitute a violation of girls' and women's human rights and are a brutal form of discrimination rooted in gender inequalities. Protecting children against harmful practices, including child, early and forced marriage, is a priority for the European Union. This has been reiterated in various policy documents, including in the latest Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy. And I would like to rest you assured the successor of the EU Action Plan on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment in Development, will foster women's and girls' physical and psychological integrity with a specific focus on the fight against harmful traditional practices. We all know that addressing child marriage is a very complex issue. It requires a comprehensive strategy that covers the adoption of protective legislation, the enhancement of access to quality education, the promotion of gender equality, and the change of mentalities and social norms. It also requires adequate funding and well-targeted projects. We are committed to ensure both. At a Girls' Summit in London in July 2014, the European Union committed to allocating more than €100 million for the next 7 years to gender equality and children's well-being under the Global Public Goods and Challenges programme. Additional projects are also envisaged under the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights and under the Pan-African Programme Support to the African Committee of Experts on Rights and Welfare of Children, which is the only region-focused child rights instrument in the world. In order to translate our policy into actions on the ground, the European Union has developed a series of projects and actions in the framework of our cooperation with regional organizations. Also, through political dialogue, the European Union regularly engages with countries where early and forced marriages take place. 84 EU delegations worldwide have prioritized child rights in their human rights country strategies. Human rights are at the heart of our partnership with the African continent under the joint Africa-EU strategy. At the 4th Africa-EU Summit in 2014, it was agreed to work together to ensure the full respect of human rights, international law, gender equality, and to fight all forms of discrimination, racism and xenophobia. The European Union participated at the Casablanca donor meeting on ending child early and forced marriage last week, following the Girls Not Brides conference for a global partnership to end child marriage. Madam President, honourable members, all EU framework agreements with third countries, like association and cooperation agreements concluded since 1995, include a human rights clause. Through it, the parties to the agreement declare their shared commitment to promotion and protection of human rights. It also gives the EU a clear legal basis on which to raise human rights issues with the respective countries, and we regularly do so. Moreover, some EU framework agreements include articles on human rights cooperation and on cooperation related to gender equality. On this basis, specific cooperation initiatives can be agreed to fight against child marriage. The European Union welcomed the entry into force in August 2014 of the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence against Women and Domestic Violence. So far, 37 countries, of which 23 are EU member states, have signed the Convention, and 18 countries have ratified it, of which 11 EU member states. National ratification processes are progressing well. 5 member states ratified in 2014 alone. The Commission services are also examining the legal, policy and practical implication of a possible EU accession to the Convention. As part of its initiatives to tackle violence against women, the Commission funds national awareness-raising campaigns by member states, grassroots projects by civil society organizations, and European networks in this area. These campaigns, projects and networks play an important role in raising awareness of the Convention and in promoting its ratification and proper implementation. To conclude, I would like to praise the work done by the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee and the Human Rights Subcommittee. Both use every opportunity to raise awareness and challenges practices contrary to our human rights principle. Your work is absolutely essential to the upholding of human rights principles within our partners' countries, and I am thankful for it. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Nous commençons le tour de parole au nom des groupes avec madame Záborská.
On behalf of the groups, we'll start with Mrs. Záborská, 2 minutes from the EPP.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, Monsieur Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner. Predčasné sobáše detí sú v príkrom rozpore s kresťanskou a zatiaľ našťastie aj s...
So, thank you, Chair. Forced marriage of children is against both Christian and European values. It's also against human rights and value. We think it's also important to say that it's against international law, and so it's important that it's anchored in international conventions. I therefore support all conventions that prevent forced marriage. Family planning is also important here. It's absurd if we talk in one sentence between family planning and at the same time mention girls or treat girls as if they are adults. If we really want to do something against forced marriage internationally, then we have to above all aim to ensure that we work in the third countries where this exists and ensure that the convention is applied. I think that the Commission knows that the importance of monitoring the danger points across the world. It's always got to be underlined that forced marriages have got to stop in our relationships with third countries. Also, there's the need to stress the possibility that development aid will be reduced. We have to look at this as part of the protection of children. We have to help children, and we have to protect them from possible damage in the future. What's worse is the fact that we find that young people are being permanently damaged. We should be helping them.
1 minute 30.
Mrs. García Pérez, 1 minute. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We had the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, with us here this afternoon. As part of his speech, he talked about one of the most important values of the EU being united in diversity to defend human rights. That's what we're doing right now. We have different ideological positions on a lot of issues, but we all share this concern on this particular issue that so affects us when we see girls within the EU, outside of the EU, who are being forced into marriage. There's a report from 2014 that says this is also the case during the EU, that we're seeing these forced marriages as well. So I would call on the Commission, through the work it's doing to through its gender equality strategy post 2014, to incorporate strategies to tackle this issue, and also an external cooperation policy as well. The gender perspective is key. It needs to be incorporated. When we look at policies, most of them incorporate gender, but then afterwards we see that only 28% of projects financed in development cooperation really did incorporate this gender aspect. We're talking about fundamental rights here. We're talking about tackling domestic gender violence and the rights of women and girls here. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute 30 au nom de l'ECR, madame
And Mrs. WIŚNIEWSKA for the ECR, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, every year about 14 million girls marry before they turn 18. In the case of an 8-year-old girl from Yemen who died because of internal bleeding after the night spent after her husband, who was 5 times older than her. That's a harmful issue. It's a public issue. It's not a private thing in families. It must be treated as a crime. An early marriage is cutting the childhood short for the child. It's abusing the rights of the child. Therefore, it should be legally regulated in the penal code. We must not turn our eyes away from it. We must act against it, but not by trying to convince the EU to ratify the Istanbul Convention, where the ideology behind it will not only not solve the problem, but will open a possibility for damage the society and to attack family. We must counteract early marriages in our talks to partner countries on cooperation between the EU and a given country. We must also make sure so that such cases do not take place in member states of the EU, although there is a formal ban. Awareness campaigns are necessary. People must realize what negative consequences go with it. This cannot be tolerated. The speaker is interrupted.
Merci, Madame, votre temps est écoulé.
Thank you. I'm afraid your time is up. Thank you very much. Mrs. Becerra Basterrecchea, 1 minute.
Thanks, Madam President. Thank you, Commissioner. I would like to congratulate Mr. Corazza-Bildt for having asked this oral question today and having achieved consensus among the political groups to discuss something which often we don't talk about. We complain about paedophilia, we're willing to do things about that. But when we were told by the Sakharov Prize winner that rape is a weapon of war used to destroy communities, well, forced marriage is a way of destroying children's lives. It's not simply an attack on human rights. It's a violation of children's rights and it's violence against women. The repercussions of this can be devastating for children. It's not just a health issue, a question of sexual abuse and domestic violence. It destroys their future because it destroys their possibility to empower themselves and flourish through education. I'd like to stress also the role of the Commission here. The Commission can make sure that we sign the Istanbul Convention and ratify it, which stipulates that we need to eliminate forced marriage from our societies. I'd also like to stress that we're not just talking about rights and the violation of those rights, but we're talking about democratic standards. And our standing in the world as a demonstration of those rights. But as Ban Ki-moon said this afternoon, it's crucial that inclusive democracy and our role as a driving force for the defence of human rights throughout the world be looked at with particular clarity and a particular desire to eliminate forced marriage from those countries with whom we have agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to say you were speaking on behalf of the ALDE group. I now give the floor to Mrs. Forenza for the GUI group for 1 minute.
Grazie. Thank you very much, Chair. I also want to state once again that the question we're talking about today is a question which really looks at an issue which talks to us not just about the violence against minorities, against, for example, children forced into marriage, but also it's about male violence against women because they choose them. Unlike Madam Becerra, I think that we need to work for a full application of the convention, that would be a fundamental step and very important in order to push forward the issue we're talking about today. I think that we have to work also on the trade agreements that exist with third countries against this plague. But also we have to work in order to try and create inside the Union, where there are cases where it's needed, and more awareness amongst young people, amongst young girls, of this danger, and to ensure that there are proper resources given to this via education.
Monsieur Sébastien, au nom des Verts pour 1 minute 30.
Mrs. Sebastia for the Green Group, 1 minute and a half. Thank you very much. My colleague García Pérez has already said this. In the EU, there are cases of forced marriage. on a fundamental rights study from past October, we see there are groups such as the Roma, and here 2% of girls between 10 and 15 years old were forced into marriages, and a certain number of adolescents as well. The internal situation in the EU is quite concerning. We would like to see the Commission eradicate this practice in Europe. With regards to foreign external policy, there are a number of countries where we see this terrible practice. In order to do this, we need to combat this through our trade policy. But we don't have that commitment to put this gender balanced aspect into our policies. It's very important this is incorporated. We need to firmly say to these countries where women are treated as second or third class citizens that they must respect fundamental rights. We need to apply this with conviction. We need to be firm. We need to have a feminist foreign policy. Why not? Women who were forced into marriage as girls in countries such as India, this is a burden they'll have to bear for the rest of their lives, and we hope that the European Union will act swiftly and decisively. Thank you very much, Ms. AIUTO. 2 minutes for the EFDD.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, pretty much every day we read in the newspapers about women, even girls, who are forced to marry men much older than they are. Such events find fertile ground in ignorance, poverty, illiteracy, and cultural, ideological and religious beliefs that don't respect women's fundamental rights. The cultural and religious excuses for this are often a fig leaf, which is concealing the real desires, which is to carry out sexual abuses on young girls. Look at the case of Keda, a child bride who was forced to marry the head of the Chechen police more than 30 years older than she was. But these things don't just happen in third world countries, culturally and politically a long way away from us, with whom, however, the Union still carries out trade and economic agreements. But they also happen in our own borders. Forced marriage, as well as episodes of FGM and other types of anti-female violence, have a different cultural origin, different from that of the European Union, but they happen here every day, even in our cities, much closer to home than we might think. Often the things happen because of a desire to attain European citizenship, and they need to be therefore monitored and fought against. But just as we should check up on what's happening in our own house, we also need to make sure that we condemn such violence in third countries, not just in a formal way, but really checking what's going on there. Commissioner, we need to put an end to this hypocrisy. Here, as elsewhere, the European Union can't carry out economic policies and contract trade agreements with third countries without making certain that these countries respect fundamental human rights. One of those is for a woman freely to choose who she spends her time with and her life with, and that children and girls should be able to live a peaceful, calm life. Thank you.
For Madame Maier.
Thank you very much. 1 minute for Mrs. Maier.
Ja, dank u wel.
Thank you, Chair. Worldwide, there are millions of women, of children who are being forced into marriage, and very often under unfair regimes. In a third of these marriages in these countries, we have people talking about forced marriages. We very often see that there is more and more cases of forced marriages happening in Europe, and very often this is linked to the trade in human beings. It's very important that in all of the treaties and conventions that we sign, that we actually include this issue, especially in terms of Islam, its impact and the importation of Islamic values. It's very important that we ensure that we actually support girls, but the money that's available for this is actually ridiculous. And these children, these young girls are being exploited and their lives are being ruined. The problem isn't disappearing. The European Union, it doesn't have to give money. What it's got to do is it's got to close down the doors in order to stop them being imported. Thank you.
Je passe la parole
For 2 minutes, Mrs. KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Szanowni Państwo.
President, ladies and gentlemen, when a 40-year-old man marries a 12-year-old girl, then he justifies this by his tradition or a religion, which is something I deeply oppose, because in our legal codes, sex with a statutory minor is treated as a pedophile, which is tantamount to sexual, social, psychological and economic violence. This is a breaching women's rights to self-determination, which is something that, for obvious reasons, we should be combating. Not only, of course, in Asian countries, but in Europe as well. What tools do we have at our disposal to fight this phenomenon? Well, education first and foremost, because education is a door to further life. It is a door to being economically a viable citizen. This will help for such girls and women to protect themselves against violence. Another important tool is the Istanbul Convention, which bans forced marriages, and I am proud that Poland recently joined the group of European countries which ratified the convention. I am also pleased with the previous declarations by the Commission to the effect that the EU, as a party to the Convention, will ratify it, which is very needed in order to raise the awareness in Europe of the rights embedded in this Convention. At the recent UN summit, 167 countries agreed that the convention was indeed a gold standard for combating violence, and that the stipulations of the convention should be applied.
Thank you very much. And the floor goes to Mary Honeyball for 1.5 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Earlier this year, Malawi, to their very great credit, banned forced child marriage, which was a tremendous victory in a country which has one of the highest rates of forced child marriage in the world. One of the leading campaigners for this tremendous change was an 18-year-old young woman called Memory Banda, who started her advocacy on this issue when her own sister was married at the age of 11 to a man in his early 30s. The sister is now 16 and she has 3 children. Memory herself has said that marriage is often the end for girls like me, but if our leaders will invest in us and give us the chance to be educated, we will become women who create a better society for everyone. But passing laws is not the end of the story, for even when child marriage is illegal, it is still common. In India, it is illegal for girls under 18 to be married, yet UNICEF estimates that around 47% of girls in India were married before they turned 18. Simply changing the law is not enough. Information, awareness and education campaigns are crucially and vitally important to stamp out this terrible practice. We are all agreed on this, and I think the EU has a real role to play here to go out and do everything, absolutely everything we possibly can to end this barbaric and cruel practice.
Thank you much indeed. A teraz pani poseł.
Now the floor goes to Jana ŽITњANSKÁ for 1 minute. You have the floor.
Na tému nútených sobášov sa na Slovensku mnohí pozerajú ako na tému, ktorá sa našej krajine.
So the issue of forced marriage in Slovakia is something that actually is to do with the past, is to do with the situation in developing countries. These are countries where young people are being forced to marry men, and we have awful stories from a number of these countries, because here we are talking about the effect of victims. It's not always very distant countries, it's also victims who come from Slovakia and European countries. And these are people who often, in fact, also travel to foreign countries because they think they're going to find work there. And then they find themselves confronted by the reality. They find themselves married against their will. They lose their freedom and they cannot come back. If we really want to help these people, if we want to stop future young women being married against their will, then we have to ensure that we commit to greater education, and we have to ensure that appropriate social support exists and refugee support. Thank you.
Ďakujem. Señora diputada Izaskun Bilbao Barandica.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much. I would like to urge the Commissioner to keep up the pressure on third countries so this, where these practices are socially accepted. It's important to have the necessary prevention with the risk populations that we have in the EU itself. The police in Catalonia has put in place a program to raise awareness of this problem and to help victims, to provide support and contact with social services. In one of the provinces of Catalonia, 6 cases were detected. It's important that these types of marriages can be quickly and legally annulled. There needs to be a minimum age for marriage, and as I said, we need to reach out to risk groups. So I would like to know, Commissioner, if you have reliable data on the levels of this problem. This is also often linked to FGM in Europe as well. I think it could be useful to link this into awareness-raising campaigns. I have the testimony included of people who have been involved in these forced marriages who can speak out as to how this is not normal, and this is a very strong expression of the inequality that women and girls face, and this is something that can be tackled with success. I look forward to hearing your response on this. We need more than just declarations. We need practical examples and tangible results that we can measure. Thank you.
Gracias. Ahora la señora diputada Ángela VALLINA. Un minuto, por favor.
Now the floor goes to Madam VALLINA.
Thank you, President. 39,000 girls are forced to marry every day. 700,000 have been married according to UNICEF figures throughout the world, 250 million of them below the age of 15. But I'd also like to mention that most of these marriages, according to all the studies that have been carried out up to date, the roots of it lie in poverty, in this perverse system which exploits human rights and exploits countries and their resources, which is basically a return to slavery. 36 million people in the world live in slavery, according to the World Free Foundation. I'd also like to see when the European Union is going to sign the Istanbul Convention and declare 2016 as the European Year Against Gender Violence. We are convinced that without equality there's no development, there's no justice, there's no democracy. Thanks very much.
Gracias. Netrva Siainen, Heidi Hautala. 1 minuutti.
Kiitos paljon, herra puhemies. Thank you very much, President. It's absolutely...
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Ja tämäkin osoittaa sen, miten tärkeää on, että me nostamme nämä varhaiset lapsiavioliitot aivan keskiöön, kun taistelemme tyttöjen ja naisten oikeuksien puolesta. Ja nyt kun komissio valmistelee tätä
We have to fight against violence against women and children. I know that currently the Commission is fighting against that and will take it into account. Now, I saw that in practice the change in legislation isn't enough on its own. Sometimes there's a good constitution in a country which protects young women up to 18 and protects them from marriage up until 18, but sometimes there are exceptions. Sometimes there are exceptions which are given by judges, which is the case, for example, in Morocco, where you can actually force very young children to get married, or Tanzania, where there's a very good constitution from a legal point of view, but there's also traditional law which carries the day. Now, this is why it's important that we also talk about some of the leaders, the chiefs in these traditional groups, and it's important that young girls can go to school and that they can take their own life in control.
Otitko sä multa Miki? Multakatos Mikke.
1.5 minutes. Take a floor, please.
Thank you. The issue of forced marriage does not just affect children living on the African and Asian continents. It's happening across Europe, and the silence surrounding it has many parallels with the exploitation and trafficking of young girls across many towns in northern England. UK law imposes a maximum sentence of 7 years on the perpetrators of this crime, and it's simply not a strong enough deterrent. Girls are afraid to speak out. Others dismiss it as a cultural practice, and our social services in England, the police, the politicians, dare not speak up for fear of being labelled racist. With open borders, human traffickers have free rein to exploit children. In 2013, over 600 children were trafficked into Britain for exploitation and forced marriage. This modern-day form of slavery is on the rise, and the EU have given the perpetrators a helping hand. By not allowing member states to control their own borders and check criminal backgrounds, the EU is enabling this crime to escalate. The UK can at least check an individual's passport. Mainland Europe is prevented from even doing that. Criminal trafficking gangs operate with impunity due to EU free movement rules. So whilst members are very good at voicing their outrage at these crimes, they are fundamentally unable to implement anything practical to actually stop it.
Thank you. I don't see Mr. Honorable Gianluca Buonanno. Deputy Csaba SÓGOR. 2 minutes. Take a floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. Traditions, especially those of indigenous and minority groups, are essential as they often embody the continuous existence of a community. However, as we have seen a couple of years ago, certain countries tried to push through a process to legitimize the concept of traditional values of humankind as the basis for human rights law at the Human Rights Council led by the Russian Federation. There is an inherent danger to making traditional values the standard for human rights. These values do not only evolve constantly, they are also difficult and dangerous to define. It is within this context that culture cannot be used to undermine the universality of human rights principles, which is applicable to the practice of early and forced marriage of girls. Firstly, the EU ensures that gender equality is one of the agenda in every dialogue with third countries, especially for development cooperation. However, it should keep on mainstreaming gender equality in all policy areas and programmes, especially inside the Union. Too many girls in Europe are still deprived of their right to education because they are forced into marriages. Secondly, there is an urgent need to reliable data on forced marriage inside the European Union. Lastly, the European Parliament has urged the Commission in the past to promote the national ratification of the Istanbul Convention and even launched the procedure for the EU's accession to it. I urge Commissioner Jourova to pursue this is a priority, so the battle against forced and early marriages can take place in a harmonised way across the entire European Union. Thanks.
Köszönöm, képviselő SÓGOR. Jetzt Abgeordnete Maria Neuchl. 1,5 Minuten.
Mrs. Neuchel next for 1.5 minutes. Forced labour for children is a serious crime, but also children in forced marriages mean their lives are ended on the day of their marriage. There's often violence. It's a completely unbalanced relationship there, and this isn't about being partners. This type of marriage is never entered into voluntarily. It's never a good thing. Girls and women who are forced into these marriages have a lifelong of violence and sexual violence perpetrated against them. There are 3 types of perpetrators, and these groups of perpetrators are not just in other countries, in third countries, they're in the EU as well. And these are men who should be convicted, they should be punished. There are people who are involved in these forced marriages who also need to take responsibility. There's society, there are politicians who know exactly what's going on. They know that there are these victims and they shouldn't protect them. So I turn to you, to the Commission today. We need to have reliable data on what's going on in Europe. We need proper sanctions in Europe. We need support systems. We need protection in these cases. We need understanding for the victims, and we need, above all, to ratify the Istanbul Convention. We need that now. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. I don't see Mr. Václav Henke. Deputy Davor Ivo Stier, 2 minutes, take over, please.
Thank you. According to UNICEF data, every year 15 million girls, of which are only 5 years old, are forced to marry much older men. These early and very often forced marriages are most of all made in developing countries. 1 of 3 girls under the age of 18 in developing countries is forced to make such an early marriage. In countries such as Niger, Chad and Mali, this number is even higher. More than 70% of girls are forced to marry early. This practice is an unacceptable violation of human rights of both women and children, and also endangers their health, their education and their social status. It also has devastating consequences on the economy and on society. Forced marriages do not enable us to eradicate poverty. So this harmful practice must be stamped out by carrying out measures of cooperation with third countries. This year we have the opportunity to place women and girls at the center of our efforts, which has been required by the European Parliament in the negotiations of the development framework after 2015, when we sent a clear message that women and girls must be the focus of our efforts, because we can then stop the vicious cycle of poverty before it starts. Therefore, I would like to welcome what Commissioner Mimica said and invite the Commission to still insist on human rights with the countries receiving development aid, and also to insist on the development of legal frameworks which will eradicate this harmful practice. Thank you.
Hvala. Agora, Senhora Deputado Liliana Rodrigues.
Thank you, President. Forced marriage is an example of extreme criminal violence which mainly affects women and young children. It robs them of their innocence. It's not just physical violence and sexual abuse. It also leads to early death of one's desires and one's dreams. Girls aren't allowed to play anymore and enter into married life. These people ought to be in schools. They ought to be educated. They're actually sold off, literally sold, by their families in the name of custom and tradition. Obviously, a lot of the men who marry them are far older than they are and are happy to rape these young girls. There's a cultural, religious and social support for this kind of thing, and sometimes people talk about a dowry, which is of course merely a payment, and what we're talking about is tantamount to slavery. Many girls and young women are slaves here in Europe too. These women are filled with shame, unwilling that people find out about how they were obliged to marry, and ashamed that no one protects them from a custom which is simply a tradition that is killing them. We're talking often now about some European or Western women who travel to Syria and countries like that and are forced to marry, sometimes raped, sometimes murdered. one woman was sold 22 times. 22 times. And what are we doing for these young people? For all of these girls and children who are brutally raped by their husbands? Some children at the age of 12 or 13 already have children themselves. We need to do something in Europe, not making sure that women are not regarded as chattels and not regarded as slaves.
Pan poseł, pan marszałek Marek Jurek. Minuta, bardzo proszę.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Mr. Jurek, for 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. In this interesting debate, we already heard at the beginning about Yemen, about Africa. We heard about the Istanbul Convention. But only a few female colleagues mentioned the fact that when we talk about this form of violence towards women, that they're not women, they're girls, we talk about a phenomenon which is also present here today in Europe. A few years ago, information was published which suggested that in certain circles in Germany, 1 in 10 women could be subject to such a procedure. But how is it possible if there is the Istanbul Convention? So what countries are affected? Not the countries that decided to defend the national shape of family. Not in Slovenia, not in Croatia, not in Lithuania. It's a problem at 90-something%. It's a problem of Muslim immigrants in Europe. I'm not surprised that we're talking around the problem, beating around the bushes, if we don't want to name it the way it is. Let me say this. We, Poles in Central Eastern Europe, we want to have the choice not to commit your mistakes and not to enter this road of policies that you're trying to impose upon us today, where the dark side of it is being discussed just today. Thank you very much.
Panie pośle, czy akceptuje pan?
Would you accept a question from the blue card procedure? You would? Yeah.
Micro, please. Micro. Mikrofon, panie pośle, przepraszam.
Mikrofon jest włączony.
Well, the microphone is on. Can you hear me? I want to ask you a question. Wouldn't you agree, sir, that this is contrary to the principle of equality of gender? We're talking about forced marriages of girls, but what about boys and men? It happens as well. Well, thank you very much, sir. Usually we take care to protect the weaker party, but it's true in many countries. In Germany, it is a problem. Also, young men, boys, are forced to marry. So yeah, I would agree with you, sir, but let me repeat, let's focus on those social strata where this drama is taking place, and we're talking about multiculturalism.
Nyní poslanec Tomáš Zdechowski, 2 minuty.
Děkuji, pane předsedající.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate your Czech, which is wonderful. It's getting better and better every time with every plenary session. But now to the topic that is very important and difficult to understand sometimes. First of all, I would like to say that our role is to protect the rights of the child. So forced marriages this problem does not concern only girls but also boys. Children, that's the most vulnerable group of population. Children must have the right to decide freely. We cannot dictate them whom to marry. So that's the reason why there are a lot of new initiatives created in Europe. For example, in Great Britain recently, there is an initiative that protects children who do not want to be taken, for example, to India. So then such a child, when is screened in the airport, so the child is instructed to take with him or with her, for example, a spoon and in the underwear. So then when it is detected, so the police or the guards know that it was against the will of the child. So I'm happy that there are a lot of organizations, NGOs that are involved in this problem. So there are a lot of good examples all over the world, but Europe should focus on its own problems inside, because dozens of thousands of children are forced to marriage within the EU, to marry somebody they don't want to marry. So we have to eliminate this, not only by adopting resolutions, but by fighting against this phenomenon that is old as the humanity.
Pane poslanec, thank you much indeed for your compliment about my Czech language. I respect your sense of humor. Deputy Viorica DâNCILâN, 1.5 minutes, take the floor, please.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Potrivit
Thank you very much.
2 milioane de tinere fete sub 18 ani sunt sau vor fi căsătorite.
Yes, so, well, to 2011-2020, there have been a huge number of girls been forced into forced marriage, and this is developing and getting worse, especially in the Saharan area and in Africa. There's 39,000 forced marriages every day, and the statistics don't stop there. 1 girl in 4 is married without her agreement between the ages of 14 and 18. Young girls are married against her will between 10 and 14. 1 of these girls out of every 2 ends up giving birth to a child. We shouldn't forget that in 2009, more than half of the world population, 56% in other words, lives with less than 1.36 euros a day, and this in fact is the origin of this plague of forced marriage, because in fact these forced marriages in fact are an income source for very many of these families. Women in these countries in fact are simply treated, young girls are treated like objects. The families can dispose of them as they think fit. If we analyse the situation of all these children that are over the age of 6, there's 32 children over the age of 6 who have never set foot in a school. And if we don't understand these figures, we're not going to understand that, in fact, forced marriage is, in fact, a solution, very often the only solution that exists for these young girls to survive, these young girls who have no education. I had 1.5 minutes. Very sorry, I went over, says the speaker.
Doamna deputat Viorica DâNCILâN, you accept a blue card from Mr. Minister Paet? Please, take the floor.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair, for referring to my previous job. But I have a question. Of course, forced marriages is a violation of human rights. Statistics show that there are suicides among teenage girls more than there are those who die during labor. This is a serious problem. The EU has signed a number of agreements with countries where forced marriages are a problem. What is your opinion about development aid? When we give development aid, how much should we pay attention to the violation of human rights, and especially to forced marriages in the countries where we forward development aid to? How much relation should there be between the two things?
Cu siguranță că Uniunea Europeană are în multe cazuri acorduri de
I think it's clear that, as in a lot of cases, the EU has cooperation agreements with these countries. We need to put the focus on education. This would allow those young people to be able to survive, to educate themselves, to find a job. It would be an alternative to ending up in this type of situation. I think it's clear colleagues have raised all these subjects.
Deputy Ruža TOMAŠIĆ. 1 minute. Take the floor, please.
The early forced marriage of girls is a horrific practice I condemned most strongly. We must fight against this violence on girls who are neither mentally nor physically ready to be married or take on the demanding roles of wives and mothers. In relations with third countries, we must insist on the respect on children's human rights, and we must fight against such abuse of girls. However, I believe that stomping out this terrible practice in the EU is even more important. Otherwise, Europe will lose its credibility in relations with third countries. The stronger integration of minority groups, where early forced marriage of girls is still practiced, should not be just an option, but an obligation for both member states and members of those minorities. This practice does not belong in European societies. It should be clearly condemned, and perpetrators of violence against girls should be drastically punished. Thank you.
We are now moving on to the Catch the Eye procedure. The first speaker is Patricia ŠULIN. You have the floor.
Thank you. According to UNICEF, more than 700 million women were married before the age of 18 and much more before the age of 15. These are unimaginable figures which show that when it comes to discrimination of women, there is a lot of work ahead of us. I am very pleased to see that the Istanbul Convention, which tries to prevent discrimination of women, that this convention was signed by Slovenia, which has also ratified it. Therefore, we have the legal basis, but we need more determined steps in fighting for equality of genders. I believe that we should strengthen our information campaign and awareness of our citizens about this sort of crime, because figures show that in some countries a very high percentage of adolescent women were subject to violence but never sought any help. Thank you.
Thank you for a very impressive speech. Onorevole Caterina CHINNICI. Prego, por favor.
Thank you, President. All children have the right to live their innocent childhood and adolescence in every country in the world. But as we know, in some parts of the world, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, the forced marriage of children is very widespread. This leads to early pregnancy, the death of the child and the death of the child mother as well. People, of course, are forced to leave school as well. Different socio-cultural traditions in these countries lead me now to think that we shouldn't tolerate this anymore. Look at Articles 12 and 19 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Adolescent. I do hope, therefore, that the Commission will play a role as a driving force in pushing through specific legal measures to raise awareness about this unacceptable practice. Thanks very much, Mr. President.
Grazie, onorevole. Notis Marias.
President, the practice of early forced marriage of girls, particularly in Africa and South Asia, is causing concern in many countries and particularly in the European Union. Of course, it's a violation of the human rights of girls and women, and as well as being a major health issue. The consequences are terrible for women and for societies as well. They get trapped in the cycle of poverty because a marriage, of course, reduces one's opportunity and reduces social cohesion as well. In the Member States of the European Union, 23 have signed, but very few, only 11, have ratified the convention, which condemns violence against women as well as domestic violence too, which would of course include forced marriage as a human rights violation. In 2014 we saw that this is also a problem in member states such as Germany. The Commission has said it's taking a stance against violence against women. We now hope that the Commission will lead the Union to sign the Istanbul Convention and move forward on this.
Deputy Ivan Jakovčić.
We have witnessed horrible practices when speaking about girls, when speaking about violence against young women, and we have to do our utmost to stop this practice. I would like to emphasize that we're talking about physical and psychological traumas that these young women and girls go through. And with the exception of Africa, where this practice is widespread, unfortunately this practice can be seen on our continent and in some member states and candidate countries. In the Balkans, this practice still exists, and sometimes parents decide on behalf of girls and boys that they should marry someone. And this is why I would like to call on the European Commission to make the member states sign the Istanbul Convention.
Deputy Mariana Petir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1 in 3 girls is married before the age of 18. Among them, 1 in 9 before the age of 15. 15 million throughout the world every year, more than 41,000 per day, 1 year every second. To be more specific, from my first word until the end of my 1-minute speech, 30 girls will be married by force because they were born as girls, because they cost too much their families. Children should have the right to be children, and girls should have the right to choose whom they will marry and with whom they will start a family. We should ensure that they have a carefree childhood, and this is something that the future of humanity depends on. We must save their childhoods. We must ensure that each child has access to education. This is something we should strive to, and we should take serious action. This is not just a question of signing international conventions. This is a question of our human dignity.
Domn deputat Toru Frunzilika, 1 minut.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie President. I truly hope that the Commission is going to carry out a concrete plan of actions with a view of ending child marriage. Many girls that become pregnant early have to cope with dangerous risks to their health and to that of their children. The majority of these girls are forced to leave school before finishing primary school, and many suffer from violence and sexual abuse. It is important to establish information and awareness-raising campaigns in communities in which this gender-based human rights violation is practiced and are put in place. These girls often see their role in their world only as baby makers. We must change that, put these convictions into discussion and help the girls in making the right choices. And I'd like also to transmit a message to the Commission and to the Commissioner present here. As it was mentioned before, we face this situation in Europe as well, not only in the developing countries. Look at some Muslim communities in Europe and Roma communities as well. We should have also to address these issues in the European Union as well. Thank you.
Mulțumesc. Deputy Stanislav Polčák.
Děkuji, pane předsedo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the floor. I have to admit that I'm shocked, I'm surprised by the information that I received thanks to this debate. I didn't realize that it is such a serious problem even within the EU. I apologize for my ignorance, so next time I would prefer not to be shocked, and I would wish that the EU focuses on such countries where the rights are not infringed in such a manner, and so that our development programs are focused only on these countries and not on those countries where fundamental rights are violated.
Děkuji. Onorevole Nicola Caputo. Prego, por favor.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. In the last 10 years, so many people have been forced to marry. By 2050, there'll be over 1 billion who have been forced to do so. This is a very impressive number. And this leads to premature death, both of girls and of children. And there's negative impact on the future lives of these children. It prevents girls from taking independent decisions, from growing up appropriately and being able to educate themselves. So I think it's extremely important that the Parliament takes a position in this, and that we recognise the importance of ensuring that these forced marriages do not take place. And that is part of the equality of gender also. It's important that the Commission uses all of its possibilities in terms of cultural diplomacy and relationships with third countries in order to ensure that forced marriages in fact do not take place, and that we say very clearly that these are unacceptable and shameful practices.
Madame Soraya Post.
Tack så mycket. Äktenskap där en eller båda parterna är barn bör alltid.
Thank you very much. What we're talking about here is marriage, but forced marriage, which could never or should never be considered to be legal marriage. These children are forced into these marriages. And we're not just talking about the third world, we're talking within our own borders as well. I think what's really quite unbelievable is that we see what's happening, but we don't really know how to protect these young women and girls who are forced into these marriages. The Istanbul Convention exists, and the idea is to tackle these forced marriages. It's a sort of structural violence against women. They learn very early on about the inequalities between men and women. The Commission needs to act in a resolute manner. It's important to see how we can act to end these types of marriages and other types of violence against children. The Istanbul Convention is one that all member states should ratify. It's important for this process to be got underway so that all member states can ratify the convention, and we can provide economic support to organisations that are working to end these forced marriages that affect these parts of the population.
Fru Vice Post. Now, on behalf of the European Commission, Commissioner Neven Mimica. Molim.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members, throughout this debate I have seen a joint commitment to the elimination of the child, early and forced marriages. To ensure this, we need to develop overall strategies that impact on issues interrelated to harmful practices, such as birth registration, to provide girls with a legal identity, improved access to health services, and engaging on issues such as adolescent pregnancy, which jeopardizes girls' rights. In particular, I would like to stress the need to focus on education. Educated girls become empowered women who can challenge social norms. We need awareness raising leading to public declarations of abandonment, broad-based social mobilization, and legal and policy measures. We need knowledge so that we can better understand the dynamics of social norms. Regarding data on forced marriages and genital mutilation in the EU member states, I would like to inform you that the European Institute on Gender Equality is expected to publish a report on the 9th of June. Allow me to thank the honourable members and the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee for being active and dedicated on gender issues, especially this year when we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 15th anniversary of the UN Security Council's Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you much indeed, Mr. Commissioner. Zamykam debatę.
The debate is closed. I thank all speakers. The next item on the agenda are 1-minute speeches based on Article 163 on the regulations of the European Parliament. And the floor goes to the first speaker, Mr. Pospíšil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to refer to one phenomenon from the Czech Republic. It was the discussion about the report of the European Commission regarding fight against communism. The Czech politicians were not able to agree to the extent whether the Czech law is able to prosecute the phenomenon of foreign fighters. And so this was a discussion among politicians. When I was listening to them, so I realized how problematic this is. That means those who leave the European Union and then join the Islamic State fighters. So I think that the European Commission should prepare a piece of legislation to harmonize this practice among member states.
Deputy Andrés Mamikins, take a floor, please.
President, when addressing global problems, we cannot forget about the regions suffering from long economic depression. Latgale region is in the east of Latvia. Latgale people have their own language and their own rich traditions. However, since 2004, when Latvia joined the European Union, Latgale's population has decreased by 15%. Young families are forced to leave the region in big numbers. The main reason is huge unemployment. 18.5% of economically active people cannot find a job. Half of them are long-term unemployed. In order to create new jobs in Latgale, serious financial support of the European Union is needed, and this can be done by setting proper priorities within the existing budget and developing proposals for next budgets. Dear colleagues, it will be shame on both the government of Latvia and the European Union if this beautiful place stays abandoned. Let's save Latvia. Latgale, sorry.
Deputy Branislav Skripek. I don't see Mr. Skripek. It's a pity. Anapriotis Notis Marias.
President, I've repeatedly raised in this plenary the question of Germany's debt to Greece, the question of war reparations, which were found that they owed several million euros with interest in Paris in 1948. We're now talking about 500 million at least, which they owe to Greece. There's also the question of the crimes committed by the Nazi occupation troops